Napoleon did not merely conquer Europe. He effectively turned it into a source of revenue. He forced kingdoms to march behind him. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed borders like machines. Monarchies collapsed. Treaties were signed. Maps were redrawn from scratch. But behind all that military discipline, there was a quieter, colder, more calculated truth. Napoleon built such a war machine that he compelled Europe to finance its own submission. Welcome to the Financial Anatomy Channel, where money, power, history, and stability intersect. And it's worth stating this from the very beginning. Nothing is ever as simple as it appears. At the height of his power, Napoleon either directly controlled or indirectly dominated a vast geography stretching from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to southern Italy. At one point, the Grande Armée mobilized more than 600,000 soldiers. For Europe at that time, this was an astonishing figure. But we cannot move forward without asking one question. Where did the budget come from to feed, equip, arm, and pay such an enormous force? Because soldiers may be emotional, logistics never is. Every uniform equals money. Every piece of equipment equals money. Every horse, every sack of grain, every salary payment equals money. And here lies the irony. When Napoleon took power in 1799, France was not wealthy. On the contrary, it was financially exhausted, trust had collapsed, and the economy was in ruins. If we want to understand how Napoleon financed his empire, we must begin this story with collapse. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy was drowning in debt. The 7 Years' War had generated massive costs. Then France's support for the American Revolution added nearly 1.3 billion livres more to the royal debt. By 1788, the situation looked like this. More than half of state revenues were used solely to pay interest. This is important. The French monarchy did not collapse only because of ideas. Slogans about liberty alone did not dethrone the king. The real issue was this. The state could not pay its bills. Then came the revolution, and with it a harsh financial experiment. In 1790, revolutionary leaders issued assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church lands. At first glance it seemed logical. Use seized property as collateral, print money, inject liquidity into the economy, stabilize the system. On paper, it was genuinely clever, but in reality, the government never hit the brakes. Money printing continued aggressively. By 1795, more than 45 billion livres in assignats had been released into circulation, and the result? Inflation spiraled out of control. The currency lost value. Prices skyrocketed. Savings were wiped out. Trust collapsed. France nearly entered a period of hyperinflation. If there were an award for financial improvisation under pressure, revolutionary France might have won it briefly, just before the currency disintegrated. In 1799, after the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon inherited exactly such a country. Worn down by internal unrest, economically shattered, and at war with multiple European coalitions. The fundamental truth Napoleon recognized was this: you cannot wage permanent war amid monetary chaos. So his first move was not a new invasion, it was stability. In 1800 he founded the Bank of France. It was not fully independent in the modern sense, but it restored structure and confidence to the financial system. In 1803, a stable and predictable monetary system based on gold and silver was introduced. Tax collection was centralized. The administrative structure was modernized. Corruption was drastically reduced. State accounts came under tighter supervision. Napoleon implemented an astonishingly disciplined fiscal management system. In the early years of his rule, budgets were almost always balanced. But the real breaking point begins here. Napoleon did not want to place the full cost of permanent war on the French people, so he externalized the payments. After every major victory, France imposed heavy indemnities on defeated states. These were not symbolic penalties. They were real, massive transfers that strained entire economies. In 1805, Austria was defeated at Austerlitz, and under the Treaty of Pressburg was forced to pay 40 million francs. In 1807, Prussia was defeated and, under the Treaty of Tilsit, compelled to contribute nearly 120 million francs. Now consider the scale. In the early 1800s, France's annual military expenditure was roughly 600 to 700 million francs. A single indemnity could finance months of warfare. Napoleon's system was simple, yet extraordinarily effective. Conquer territory, impose indemnities, maintain French troops at the expense of the occupied state, extract cash, grain, supplies, horses, finance the next campaign with those resources. War fed war. The machine kept turning, but the system had mathematical limits. It required constant expansion. As long as France kept winning, new revenue streams opened. Every victory financed the next. The empire functioned like a leveraged expansion strategy. As it grew, the burden became less visible. But when expansion slowed, the obligations remained. Napoleon did not rely solely on indemnities. He also forced occupied cities and states into compulsory loans. These were not voluntary investments. They were mandatory debts imposed under occupation. Then he deployed his most radical economic weapon, the Continental System. In 1806, unable to defeat Britain at sea, he attempted to pressure it economically. With the Berlin Decree, he banned trade with Britain. On paper, the move was bold. But Europe's economy was deeply connected to Britain, and the result? Smuggling increased. Black markets expanded, European economies suffered. When Russia began bypassing the system, the gears started to grind. Then came the Russian campaign of 1812. Nearly 600,000 soldiers were deployed, one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. But the cost was enormous, and the logistics terrifying. The campaign ended in disaster. Fewer than 100,000 soldiers returned in fighting condition. And here is the critical point. This campaign generated no revenue. There were no indemnities, no new resources, only loss. The model had shattered. Meanwhile, Britain operated under an entirely different system. With the support of the Bank of England and Parliament, it financed war through long-term government bonds, consols. By 1815, public debt had exceeded 200% of GDP, yet the system endured. Because confidence remained intact. Institutional stability existed. Napoleon's model was fast but fragile. Britain's model was slower, but predictable and scalable. This was the fundamental difference that shaped Europe after 1815. Napoleon abdicated in 1814. He returned briefly in 1815. But the Battle of Waterloo ended everything permanently. Afterward, the Congress of Vienna redrew Europe's political map. But financial losses did not disappear with diplomatic signatures. This time, France was forced to pay 700 million francs in indemnities. The wheel had turned in the opposite direction. The lesson was clear. Military power cannot endure without financial stability. Napoleon stabilized the currency. He restructured taxation. He modernized administration. But his strategic model assumed that political dominance would continuously generate renewable economic contributions. It was a model that failed to account for what happens when expansion stops. Britain, on the other hand, had built a credit-based institutional structure. The strongest army fell. The strongest bond market stood. Now let us look at today. In the current global system, the United States holds the advantage of issuing the world's reserve currency. With massive bond markets, it can finance high public debt. But this great power rests on one thing: trust. When trust is shaken, the cost returns home. Napoleon learned this when expansion stalled. History does not punish ambition, it punishes unstable financing. The Napoleonic era was not only about cannons and cavalry, it was also about balance sheets, bond markets, who paid, who generated resources, who survived without collapsing. The true empire was not the one that held the most land. It was the one that could manage credit. If this video gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing.